Hello to everyone watching. In this episode, I will discuss addiction in society today, specifically acknowledging the addiction epidemic. We have looked now at addiction through many different angles, but mostly as it regards an individual. Now I will preview the addiction situation on a greater scale. In this two-part episode, I will discuss the addiction epidemic, the layers of crisis within this epidemic, and a proposed solution and what you can do about it. The key thing here is to understand that there are layers to the addiction crisis that we see in our world today. It is the state of our internal being that allows the external world to exploit our already vulnerable and dense areas. So, while the addiction epidemic is manufactured by external forces, it is the unrefined parts of our human selves on our soul's journey that we become susceptible to this phenomenon on an individual and collective scale. So I'd say it is most important for us to identify these unresolved parts within ourselves, but also to recognize the spell that we are under in society that causes a large majority of people to fall into the diabolical enchantment of addiction, keeping in mind that everyone is susceptible to the enchantment of addiction. Now, if you've watched all the episodes preceding this, then you understand, as well as I do, that this is a phenomenon that affects the human realm, as in it is affecting everyone. It is only through the conditioning of many industry agendas that the scope of addiction has been so drastically reduced in its understanding. The truth is, this phenomenon acts as the opposition to everyone's ascension, pulling everyone into the illusion and helping to keep the delusion and chaos going. And there are advantages and disadvantages to this. The advantage is that the tests and challenges create opportunity to heal the traumas and resolve the karmas weighing you down. Every phenomenon can either be used for good and for your cultivation, or for escape and avoidance, further suppressing and delaying the inevitable issues and suffering. The disadvantage is staying forever stuck in addictive ways, lost in the delusion, falling to lower and lower standards, and forfeiting your life's cultivation and fulfillment of your life's purpose. So, starting this episode, my main point is that although there are many external forces that we could blame the addiction crisis on, we must look within ourselves to find the answers in true liberation. Solely demanding laws and organizations to change in society or begging the government to solve the problem is just missing the point. And in actuality, it is applying the addictive mindset to solve the addiction problem and continuing to externalize both the problem and the solution to the material world. So, if there's one thing to understand about addiction, it is that you cannot overcome addiction through the same level of thinking that trapped you there in the first place. Therefore, you must go within and do your own transformational work, and then through your individual recovery efforts, you will come to see or discover your unique position and purpose in the world, such as how to support and help others. So again, the three main points that I will cover in today's episode are the addiction epidemic, the layers of crisis within this epidemic, and a proposed solution. Now, the addiction epidemic. The addiction epidemic affects the whole world. Every culture, generation, and demographic is susceptible to the impact of the addiction epidemic, whether directly addicted oneself, challenged by a loved one's addiction, or in the crosshairs of local, national, or global impact. Most people think of the drug epidemic because the fatal effects happen much quicker and are a direct result of overdose. However, we are also in the midst of a food addiction epidemic, sex and pornography addiction epidemic, technology and screen addiction epidemic, and production and consumption addiction epidemic, among many others. All types of addiction take years off your life one way or another. It's just that some kill you slower and less obviously, while others kill you faster and more directly. For instance, food addiction is potentially associated with every kind of physical illness and disease, killing millions before their time. However, medical professionals and academic instructors and mainstream society are not talking about this very important link, acting as if people just spontaneously and unluckily catch an illness with no fault of their own, and it's nuts. By definition, an epidemic is something tragic, widespread, and so uncontrolled that it is affecting massive amounts of people across different regions. The addiction epidemic is pressing down upon the entire human population at epic proportions, whether by a media overdose or other addiction-related deaths, ongoing hospitalizations, emergency psychiatric care, or sustained mental health issues, divorce and family breakdown, newborns in withdrawal or going into the foster care system, unemployment and financial loss and hardship, crime rates, legal problems and incarceration, social and spiritual disconnection, stigma and reduced opportunities, or just through plain propaganda, disinformation, and deception. One way or another, everybody feels the effects of this multifaceted addiction epidemic. So let's take a look at the alcohol and drug epidemic specifically. I'm not going to speak to every kind of addiction epidemic because tracking the origins of food and technology, for instance, is more than is needed for this episode. We are just acknowledging the multi-layered nature of this addiction phenomenon. Starting with the alcohol epidemic. The use and abuse of alcohol goes far back, in and out of trends and style across cultures and generations. Alcohol comes through the fermentation of fruits, vegetables, and grains, and is consumed for relief or relaxation, escape or celebration, connection and recreation, and spiritual purposes. The production and consumption of alcohol on a mass scale dates back 300 years, and its place in society and methods to mitigate and control public drunkenness have long been debated. In the 18th century, the war for freedom and independence led colonies to different regions of the world, exercising this freedom through the production of spirits. The movement had pushback against alcohol abuse, though, and social regulations were instituted for how to conduct oneself in public when drinking alcohol. After the British Parliament passed a law that encouraged the use of grains for distilling spirits, this led to the even more widespread production and consumption of cheap spirits, beers, and liquors throughout the world. In the 19th century, following the Revolutionary War and independence of the United States of America, a lot changed around the topic of alcohol, but it certainly didn't slow the boom in production and consumption. Even despite the famous alcohol prohibition in the 1920s in the United States, the alcohol abuse epidemic grew, which is argued to be the point of prohibiting things in general is to make the people want it more. And not surprisingly, the illegal trade of alcohol spiked during Prohibition. In time, this led to every kind of solution-focused mission, project, and treatment that people could conjure up. A variety of temperance movements and community recovery groups spawned, with hundreds of people pledging to sobriety to save their community and help each other. People were treating alcoholics in their homes, in the churches, to the asylums and institutions, and to the psychiatric centers and jails as well. And then come the 20th century, addiction treatment facilities started to pop up everywhere, but still, the rates of alcohol abuse and addiction grew. For about 2 centuries, countless methods have been used to control alcohol consumption and to cure alcohol addiction, from sensible and holistic strategies to more painful and unethical treatments and lockups to the development of what we see in addiction treatment today. The addiction treatment industry, it has gone through many different phases, but ultimately it has maintained the foundation of inpatient and outpatient treatment centers in conjunction with prescription medications, sober living, and community meetings. It is estimated that 10% of people struggling with alcohol dependence seek professional help, and that sobriety success rates within the mainstream industry are estimated under 10%. With the remaining people often falling deeper into debt, pain, crisis, and addiction. If this is true, this means that 1% of people struggling with alcoholism are getting sober through the conventional addiction treatment model. Now, other industries too have tried to control the addiction problem, but despite everything, mass-spread alcohol consumption and abuse continues to hold a fierce position in society. Today and for many decades, alcohol addiction, dependence on alcohol, alcohol-related deaths and suicides, and lost or missed opportunities due to alcohol affect much of the world. Looking at alcohol consumption per capita, countries that drink the most are said to be Russia, much of Europe, the Americas, Brazil, South Africa, and Australia. It is estimated that today 15 million Americans alone suffer from alcoholism. And that's just one country, with millions more regularly consuming alcohol. By observing death certificates alone, more than 75,000 people died in the United States in 2017 due to alcohol directly. So addiction death rates related to alcohol would be much higher. 40% of all car-related deaths involve alcohol consumption by the driver. And in recent years, alcoholism in women has drastically increased too, along with alcohol abuse with minors, which continues to diminish quality of life, tear apart families, destroy career opportunities and life purpose, and take lives before their due time. Alcohol dependence and addiction is connected to 60 known illnesses, such as cirrhosis of the liver, cancer, anemia, cardiovascular disorder, dementia, gout, high blood pressure, seizures, nerve damage, infectious disease and pancreatitis, and is significantly correlated with increasing depression and suicide rates. Alcohol abuse and dependence is encouraged and normalized in many parts of the world, and it affects people at every level in society. There are a number of professions that show a high degree of alcohol addiction, such as hotel and restaurant workers, bartenders, construction and maintenance workers, entertainment jobs, salesmen and journalists, active and veteran military, lawyers and police officers, and even medical professionals like surgeons and dentists show a high rate of alcoholism. Alcohol consumption can start as young as 10 years old, and often by 16 years old, and then it can stick with a person throughout their life. And in fact, getting through high school and college without a significant amount of drinking is quite rare in many countries. And the same goes for business executives in business meetings and many other social affairs. It's rare not to see moderate to heavy alcohol consumption at most social events. Alcohol is marketed and sold in nearly all public places and in nearly every zip code around the world. So, whether you are addicted to alcohol or not, the fact that 15 million known Americans are, with millions more around the world, many who hold high-level positions acting as change-makers and policy holders, it is important to recognize how this mentality and lifestyle trickles through all of society, normalizing the heavy use of drinking for every occasion, with each day having an occasion, and how this narrative and structure of our social systems at large create society over wine, beer, and bourbon. Now, many factors over a few centuries have set the stage for the alcohol epidemic that we see today. This includes the ongoing debate regarding the freedom to choose versus the responsible use of alcohol in society versus the complete prohibition of alcohol, as well as different factions with their own agendas regarding alcohol, to people's own vulnerability and desires for escape that have led to the current situation that we see today. Consuming beer, wine, and spirits on a regular basis, and even at high rates and with high risk, is normal and encouraged in most societies. And a good majority of people continue to drink alcohol despite a number of consequences to one's mind and body, relationships, life, and soul. All right, turning now to the amphetamine epidemic. Most famously, methamphetamine, which is a highly addictive stimulant drug derived from the ephedra plant, reported to be first synthesized in 1893 by a Japanese chemist, and later refined in 1919, becoming known as crystal meth. Whether it was created for medical purposes initially or not, it eventually became more of a planted drug for recreational use and abuse. Morphing out of the alcohol epidemic, methamphetamine gained traction in the 1920s, first through social experimenting. And then in the 1930s, it really kicked up in terms of meth abuse and addiction, and then continuing to grow in popularity from there, through both pharmaceutical marketing and prescriptions and street drug varieties. The pharmaceutical company SmithKline & French first marketed methamphetamines in the United States in 1932 as a medical treatment for asthma, nasal congestion, and narcolepsy. The medication was called Benzedrine. Methamphetamine tablets were also used during World War II to keep soldiers awake and alert, which continued to spread through the 1930s and 40s. And then, in the 1950s, methamphetamine was prescribed as a weight loss drug and also as a treatment for depression and lethargy. Students, athletes, overnight workers, and youth were picking it up recreationally, but also using it as a stimulant to focus and stay awake, to increase performance, and to manage weight. But by 1959, prescriptions became mandatory as things got out of control. People were building tolerance, they were increasing their doses, and they were injecting it. And they were experiencing addiction and paranoia and delusions. As Ben Westhoff reports in his book, Fentanyl Incorporated, at this same time, in the early 1950s, Chinese communists began their own operation, employing the Mexican cartel and soon American gangs to bring meth and other drugs into the Americas. And the Soviet communists soon followed suit. Feeling the effects of targeted drug trafficking, by 1970, the United States passed the Controlled Substance Act, and meth was made illegal. However, this only served to further empower the underground drug operations. Drug manufacturers, such as the Chinese Communist Party, increased their supply to drug traffickers, mostly the Mexican cartel, expanding distribution from cities into rural communities everywhere, offering a more affordable option than cocaine. Come the 1980s, meth trafficking boomed even more, with the development of El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel operations, targeting and further infiltrating the United States. By the mid-1990s, professional meth trafficking organizations had established a number of large underground laboratories in many different regions, with smaller amateur operations popping up across many countries, from South and Central America to Mexico to the United States and Canada, and throughout many parts of Asia, Europe, Africa, and Australia. To this day, meth trafficking continues by the hands of the Sinaloa Mexican and South and Central American cartel, not to exclude other mafia operations, involving countries from Asia to Europe, and yet still believed to be fueled by the Chinese Communist Party behind the scenes. Advances in production and distribution technology and drug operations exploding via the dark web, and having infiltrated everyday corporations too, has also served to increase the supply and demand of meth. Statistically, there are at least 25 million amphetamine-type stimulant abusers worldwide, with increasing numbers reported in 2018. An estimated 964,000 people aged 12 or older reported having a methamphetamine use disorder in 2017, in just the United States alone, which means they show significant impairment, health problems, and issues throughout their life due to meth addiction. In 2017, about 15% of all drug overdoses regarded methamphetamines. Come the turn of the century, meth use is reported to have declined, but this is likely due to the increase in millions of amphetamine medications that were being prescribed. That's right, controlled methamphetamine and amphetamines are drugs that are FDA approved and prescribed for conditions like ADHD under names like Adderall, Ritalin, or Vyvanse, as well as for obesity under names like Disoxim. People abuse all types of amphetamines, so we see a meth epidemic and a prescription amphetamine epidemic, which are both trafficked underground as well. As for prescription amphetamines, these are basically methamphetamines. Prescription amphetamines have been prescribed for 100 years. Since the 1990s, millions of children have been diagnosed with ADHD, with 62% of these children being put on prescription amphetamines starting as young as 2 years old. This makes this one dangerous addictive drug, starting kids at 2 years old. The ADHD drug industry alone made more than $9 billion in just 2012, with increasing rates thereafter. In 2013, nearly 5 million people were prescribed Adderall alone, and there are many other similar prescription drugs like it. Upwards of 82% of college students have tried Adderall, with 62% of these people never having been diagnosed with ADHD. Now, 20% of college students with prescriptions have reported abusing their stimulant medication, with even more selling or giving them to others without prescriptions. Today, the illicit meth epidemic thrives, with profit margins driving the drug trade, and within some states, meth is responsible for the largest overdose and deaths of all drugs. The cost of meth to communities has been absolutely devastating. The impact of meth abuse and amphetamine abuse upon individuals is life-debilitating and life-threatening addiction, as well as uncontrollable anxiety, mood swings, manic and obsessive compulsive behavior, sudden aggression or violent behavior, confusion, distractibility, memory loss, and other mental deficiencies, chronic stress, insomnia, as well as visual and auditory hallucinations, paranoia, delusions, and even psychosis. Additionally, methamphetamine abuse commonly lead to chronic dehydration, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, sleep deprivation, the deterioration of one's skin and teeth, loss of muscle mass, and negative changes to one's brain structure and level of functioning. All right, turning now to the cocaine epidemic. As you likely know, cocaine is derived from the coca plant, another plant with thousands of years of history. Cocaine is reported to be first isolated in 1855 by German scientists, but the history of people using coca is vast before this. Come the mid-1800s, cocaine was utilized in many ways, such as by product manufacturers. For instance, in the 1860s, French chemist Angelo Mariani developed a tonic made from Bordeaux wine and cocoa leaves called Vin Mariani, and it was marketed to restore health and vitality. Or in 1886, Coca-Cola was introduced to the public with cocaine as an ingredient, hence its name, and sold to children, young adults, and adults throughout the 1890s. Cocaine was added to many household brands, in fact, from over-the-counter medications to food and beverage products. Additionally, cocaine was marketed for medical and psychiatric purposes. For instance, in 1884, Sigmund Freud is known for recommending cocaine to treat a variety of conditions, such as neurosis or depression and anxiety. Pharmaceutical companies too incorporated cocaine ingredients overtly and covertly into their medications to treat a variety of conditions. Believe it or not, cocaine was found in many addiction treatment powders and tonics in the early 1900s. So initially, cocaine was propagated as a wonder drug, but it was not too long before it became known as one of the most addictive drugs known to man. At this time, there were 200,000 known cocaine addicts in the United States. Consequently, in 1903, cocaine was removed from Coca-Cola due to health concerns from the public and tightening restrictions. And in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act forced companies to label all products with accurate ingredients. By 1912, the United States government reported 5,000 cocaine-related deaths in 1 year. It was then in 1914, with the Harrison's Narcotic Tax Act, that cocaine was regulated and taxed in the United States, educating the public to the dangers. The spread of cocaine was said to be slower during the 1930s and 40s, and then it started to get more attention during the 1950s, and then it really boomed in the 1960s. Not only were pharmaceutical companies like Merck producing cocaine at exponential rates and marketing and selling it for medical purposes, such as a surgical anesthetic or medicine to restore clarity, vitality, and energy, but during the 1960s, Soviet communists learned about the great potential of cocaine as a terrorist weapon against the West. As outlined in the book Red Cocaine by Joseph Douglas, in 1964, Soviet communists launched their Pink Epidemic mission, taking everything they learned from communist China and participating countries and investing heavily in the development of new technologies to enhance production and distribution efficiency. The operation targeted free world countries and was designed to get people addicted to the white powder as a tool for enlisting people into the Red Revolution, hence the Pink Epidemic. In other words, cocaine was used to weaken the minds and the hearts of individuals and to tear down the infrastructure of the free world to make it easier to indoctrinate the masses to the communist ideology. It is also worth noting the added mission by Soviet communists in 1967 targeting minorities and immigrants in North America, specifically Black and Hispanic populations, to create a racial divide that would distract attention away from the developing drug operations, among other things. As a result of targeted operations upon free world countries, cocaine boomed in the United States during the 1970s through the help of the Colombian and Cuban intelligence and military, later to include countries like Panama and Nicaragua, among others. On the back end, the Soviets in Moscow were believed to be in continued partnership with the Communist Party in Beijing on how to take down the free countries. So, while the Soviets are said to have worked through South and Central America, running up through Cuba to enter the United States and Canada, and also moving through many European countries, insiders report China to have continued to orchestrate behind the scenes, working with countries like Vietnam and North Korea, as well as countries like Laos, Burma, and Thailand, targeting free countries like Japan and United States soldiers in Asian countries, and also moving product directly through Mexico into North America. Now, come the 1980s, cocaine trafficking continued, but we also see the emergence of crack cocaine. An important thing to understand about the addiction epidemic is that addiction alone is not enough to increase the demand to the scale that we see today. Rather, the communist regimes heading the operations continuously create a demand and they increase the supply on their own, not the other way around. For instance, in the 1980s, pure cocaine came to market at a more available and lesser price, along with crack cocaine, to purposely get more people hooked. It should also be noted that U.S. presidents during this time, to include Nixon and Reagan, who pushed the war on drugs, would have known about these attacks by communists, and regardless of their intentions to control the drug problem, no direct efforts were made to stop the Communist Party at the top. Instead, all the efforts went into controlling the problem at the end of the line, which is a whole different rabbit hole. Today, cocaine is said to be the second most illegal drug trafficked in the world. In 2006, reports showed that over 35 million people have used cocaine in the United States alone, with 500,000 people checking into emergency departments due to cocaine abuse in the year before, and approximately 9 million reporting using crack cocaine. Today, these numbers are exponentially larger. The impact of cocaine and crack cocaine to regular users starts with damage to nasal passageways, excessive nosebleeds, sinus infection or irritation, difficulty swallowing, inflamed lungs or lung damage or lung disease, bowel issues and gastrointestinal dysfunction, weight loss and malnourishment, and disease from IV drug use or shared paraphernalia. not to mention the typical consequences of addiction to begin with to one's personal life, relationships, and spiritual journey. With a longer episode, I will continue this discussion in part 2, starting with the opioid and fentanyl epidemic, followed by the different layers of crisis within this epidemic, and then discussing a proposed solution and what you can do about it. And then at some point, I will cover the underground and above ground drug trade operations as a targeted attack upon the people of the free lands in more detail. The best way to break the spell of addiction over this world, well, is to do our own work, but also to reveal the manufactured operations at the top. Now, to integrate this episode, how has the addiction situation in society today affected you and your family, either directly or indirectly? And what more would you like to add, or would you like to learn about the addiction epidemic? Please share with me below. And thank you so much for watching this preview on the addiction epidemic. I will see you in part 2.